What happens when the galaxy does not try to conquer humanity, but decides to erase us politely? What happens when the door closes, the lights go out, and every star map says your species no longer matters? And before this story opens that door, hit like, subscribe, and share this video with the one person you know who loves watching humanity turn impossible odds into history. The order was read in a hall made for winners. Its ceiling was so high that sound seemed to climb before it fell. Its walls were lined with the flags, light sigils, memory stones, and breathing banners of 400 civilizations, all arranged with such perfect symmetry that the room itself felt less like architecture and more like a statement. This was where the galaxy came to tell itself a story about being civilized. This was where the powerful called their fear wisdom, where selfishness wore legal robes, and where cruelty, if polished long enough, could pass for policy. On that day, the policy had a beautiful name. It was called the Protective Exile Measure. The speaker read it slowly. Every word had been sanded smooth. Humanity, the measure declared, would not be attacked. Humanity would not be exterminated. Humanity would not be hunted. Humanity would simply be removed from recognized space, stripped of trade standing, denied access to official relays, cut off from sanctioned movement, and surrounded by a 600-light-year barrier no compliant member world was permitted to cross. 9 human relay spines would be seized. 36 extraction sites would be transferred to assembly administration. 2 research arrays would be closed. The colony carrier Atlas Dawn, intercepted in transit, would be placed into temporary custody, along with the 1,112 civilians aboard it. The document called that last part a safety detention, as if changing the phrase could soften the fact that families on their way to build a home had just been made into leverage. No one in the chamber shouted. That was the worst part. Outrage can still feel honest. This was cleaner than outrage. This was the quiet of people watching a thing they had wanted for a long time finally become official. When the votes began, they came one after another, cold and fast, world after world, voice after voice, approval after approval. 368 in favor, 31 opposed, 4 abstentions recorded under ceremonial objection, which meant nothing and changed nothing. Then the speaker lowered its hands, the measure passed, and the chamber broke into applause. Not respectful applause, not formal applause, satisfied applause. The kind people give when a burden leaves their shoulders and lands on someone else. In the public gallery, Director Elara Voss of the Human Strategic Transit Office sat still and listened to it. She was not humanity's ambassador. She had no speaking rights in that room. She was there because 2 months earlier she had read a stream of harmless reports, budget revisions, corridor rumors, and changes in procedural language, and she had felt something cold begin to take shape. Elara did not believe in instincts without numbers, so she collected the numbers. She watched trade committees harden. She watched access reviews slow. She watched friendly species receive quiet warnings. And by the time the vote arrived, she already knew the result. She came to witness it because some truths should enter the body through the eyes, not the briefings. Some betrayals should never be experienced secondhand. The official charge against humanity was coordinated destabilization. That was the language they used. It sounded severe but vague enough to survive scrutiny. What it meant in plain terms was that humans had spent 12 years inside the assembly doing something the assembly pretended to admire but actually feared. We had become close to people, not useful, not compliant, not strategically aligned. Close. Human engineers had slept on workshop floors beside insected machinists to restore a water network after a moonquake. Human medics had sat awake for 3 straight nights with the scaled children of a border world during a nerve fever outbreak. Human freight crews had rerouted shipments at a loss so that a distant agricultural species would not starve during a fungal blight. Human cadets had written to elders on worlds they were never supposed to see again. Human diplomats had committed the unforgivable act of treating ceremonial contacts like actual relationships, and once that happened, the old system began to crack. The assembly was built on managed distance. It could tolerate trade, treaties, complaints, fines, even military posturing. What it could not tolerate was trust that did not pass through its hands. Trust created shortcuts. Trust ignored official channels. Trust made smaller worlds less lonely and therefore harder to control. The humans were young, loud, emotional, overeager, and terribly inefficient by standards of old powers, but they also remembered names. They kept promises no one was tracking. They came back after the cameras were gone. That made them dangerous. Elara left the hall after the vote without speaking to anyone. The corridors were full of soft voices and satisfied faces. Assistants carried tablets. Officials exchanged relief like congratulations. A few of the 31 dissenting delegates looked for her, but she did not stop. She walked through the long blue tunnel to the outbound lifts, boarded a diplomatic shuttle, and spent the 6-hour transfer back to the human carrier without opening the briefing packet in her lap. She already knew what it said. What she needed was not more information. It was stillness. In that stillness, one truth kept returning, again and again, until it became almost simple. The assembly had not chosen to punish humanity because humanity was weak. It had chosen to punish humanity because humanity was becoming independent in the one-way institutions like that can never forgive. We were learning how much of the galaxy functioned on permission. Permission to travel. Permission to research. Permission to carry defensive systems above a certain yield. Permission to build long-range drives past the approved efficiency ceiling. Permission to settle a world. Permission to transmit beyond a licensed relay web. The Assembly had called these measures safeguards for emerging civilizations. Elara had spent 6 years tracing freight schedules, maintenance dependencies, and shipyard delays through those safeguards. She knew what they really were: throttles. Elegant, patient throttles. Humanity had not been brought into a family. Humanity had been folded into a machine designed to keep young species useful, grateful, and never fully grown. When she reached Earth, the panic was already global. Markets were falling in waves. Orbital traffic around Luna had doubled as emergency councils convened. Protests filled Sao Paulo, Lagos, New Delhi, Vancouver, Nairobi, Manila, and the arcologies along the Mediterranean coast. Parents were crying on camera about the people trapped aboard Atlas Dawn. Pundits spoke about sanctions, appeals, leverage, humanitarian review, and retaliatory restraint. Military channels filled with angry proposals that no serious command expected to survive first contact with reality. Every news feed carried the same impossible image: the cradle of humanity suddenly ringed by legal emptiness. Earth had not been bombed. Earth had been put away. That was somehow worse. Bombs force a response. Dismissal dares you to collapse quietly. 12 hours after landing, Elara entered the emergency chamber of the Earth Union Directorate. It was 3 levels below the old Geneva complex, inside a room built to survive siege, electromagnetic burn, and direct kinetic shock. 42 senior delegates were present in person. Another 120 joined through secure projection. Military chiefs lined the back tier. Economic ministers occupied the left arc. Science and transport sat together on the right. Everyone expected either a damage report or a salvage plan. Elara brought neither. She placed one palm on the glass table, waited for the room to settle, and said, "If we try to win our old life back, we lose." For 5 seconds nobody answered. Then the chamber erupted. Questions, protests, anger. A defense marshal demanded to know whether she was proposing surrender. A finance chair accused her of fatalism. One of the Pacific delegates asked if she had forgotten the people on Atlas Dawn. Elara did not raise her voice. She let the noise burn itself out, then spoke again. "I am proposing that we stop confusing access with freedom. The Assembly did not take away what we are. It took away what it had allowed us to borrow. Those are not the same thing." She touched the table and a model bloomed into the air. The Sol system at center, the exclusion sphere around it, the charted corridors of assembly space, and beyond them the scattered darkness that old maps labeled with lazy terms such as unproductive regions, unstable sectors, low-value drift zones, and non-priority stellar fields. Then she zoomed out. The human delegates watched the known lanes shrink into thin, glowing veins across an absurd ocean of unclaimed stars. "They locked us inside a wall," Elara said, "but they built the wall facing the wrong direction." If this story is already pulling you in, drop a comment that says "Into the Dark" and subscribe now, because the next move is the one that changes everything. What Elara proposed that day would later be called the Long Night Initiative, though nobody in that chamber used the name yet. At that moment, it was just a plan with too many zeros attached to it and almost no room for error. Humanity would stop begging for reinstatement. It would stop designing around assembly approval. It would stop building for market access and start building for permanence. The exclues. Iron Zone would not be treated as a prison, but as concealment. Every shipyard inside Sol and the outer colonies would shift to quiet surge production under civilian covers. Research teams whose work had been stalled by assembly restrictions would receive black clearance and unlimited computational priority. Mineral reserves set aside for peacetime growth would be released. The Martian foundries would move to round-the-clock fabrication. The Jovian orbitals would strip mothballed frames for raw mass. Old tunnel habitats on the moons of Saturn, once considered too expensive to expand, would become design bunkers and test beds. Most important of all, humanity would stop pushing outward along established lanes and begin moving through the places the assembly had ignored for centuries because they were too sparse, too inconvenient, or too far from profitable routes. That region had many names in old survey logs: Dead Scatter, the Outer Quiet, Null Reach. Elara gave it another one. She called it the Hollow, not because it was empty, but because emptiness is what powerful people project onto places they have never bothered to know. Some of the room thought she had lost her mind. That changed when she began showing them numbers. Assembly-approved human drives were capped at just under 4 light-years per day, not because physics demanded it, but because the review boards had buried every promising advance beneath compatibility audits, security concerns, and multi-species impact committees. Human reactor densities were similarly suppressed. Communication architecture had to rely on assembly relay grammar, which meant every message long enough or strange enough could be noticed, logged, delayed, or denied. Even agricultural replication matrices had limits on how quickly they could be deployed off recognized worlds. Humanity had mistaken those ceilings for the state of the art, because ceilings are convincing when you grow up indoors. Then Elara opened a folder that only 6 people in the chamber knew existed. Hidden inside were 3 years of stalled research from labs across Earth, Mars, Titan, and the Belt. Field-bending equations the assembly had classified as destabilizing, superconductive coil geometries disallowed for civilian use, autonomous fabrication loops rejected for violating development balance accords. Relay architectures ruled non-compliant because they could operate outside licensed networks. Humanity, it turned out, had not been lagging behind the galaxy. Humanity had been fenced. The plan passed after 11 hours of argument and 3 moments that nearly broke it. The first came from the Ethics Council, which feared that any black expansion project would become the very thing humanity claimed to resist. Elara answered with a line that would be taught in civic academies for generations. "Then we do not build an empire of ownership. We build an empire of arrival. We do not take worlds. We connect them." The second came from the Treasury, which warned that the cost could cripple every social system on Earth for a decade. Elara answered with the harsher truth: "If we do nothing, the cost will be paid forever." The third came from the families of Atlas Dawn, whose representatives had been given emergency floor time. One father stood with shaking hands and asked, in a voice far too calm, whether her plan was going to save the people already taken. Every person in the chamber turned to Elara. She did not offer comfort, she offered intent. "Yes," she said, "but not first. First we become the kind of civilization that cannot be ignored when it asks." It was the cruelest honest answer in the room. It was also the one they voted for. What followed was not glorious. History loves to compress labor into montage, But those 18 months were made of sleepless shifts, broken hands, drained budgets, marriages under strain, public lies told for strategic reasons, and millions of people accepting smaller lives in the short term because they believed their children might deserve larger ones later. The sky above Mars glowed night after night with launch bloom. Lunar dry docks split open and released skeletal frames wrapped in thermal veils. Mining towns across the belt doubled their output and then doubled it again. Students who thought they were joining research internships discovered they were helping rewrite the transport logic of a civilization. Retired navigators were recalled. Probabilistic cartographers became celebrities in secure circles. Software crews lived on caffeine and stubbornness as they designed a non-assembly relay language from scratch, one that could scatter, braid, hide, and reassemble packets across field nodes too small to attract casual scans. 2 generations of quiet human frustration, all the times we had been told not yet, not like that, not so fast, not without approval, suddenly found somewhere to go. The First Fleet left 16 months after the expulsion vote. It did not leave in triumph. There were no parades, no public speeches, no live feeds. 17 vessels slipped outward under layered signatures and civilian covers, past the legal edge of the exclusion zone in a spread wide enough to look accidental, then dropped into the black between recognized routes. Each ship carried not soldiers first, but builders, habitat engineers, fabrication chemists, stellar survey teams, microbial ecologists, power grid architects, medics, and logistics crews who knew how to turn bare rock into a schedule. Their destination was a system catalogued a century earlier by a board assembly probe and dismissed as irrelevant. Elara chose it precisely because someone powerful had once failed to care. The inner planet was scorched. The outer gas dwarf was useless. But the second world had water locked under volcanic crust. The fourth moon had vanadium seams thick enough to alter an industry, and the system's magnetic geometry made it ideal for hidden relay anchors. By assembly standards, it was nothing. By human standards, in that moment, it was a door. The colony did not get a poetic name. Not at first. On the planning boards, it was Site Black One. On maintenance chatter, it became Black One. Then one sleepless welder looked through a viewport at the half-built habitat ring floating against a field of cold stars and said, "Looks like a lantern hanging in a cave." By the end of the week, everyone was calling it Lantern. Within 4 months, there were 3 lantern sites along 3 different vectors, each far enough from known lanes to remain invisible unless someone was specifically looking for them, each close enough to the others for the new relay spine to matter. The relay system itself was a masterpiece of desperation. Traditional assembly relays were bright, centralized, and easy to govern. Human relays became distributed, dim, and self-healing. They hid in debris fields, rode inside inactive ore shells, drifted as thermal trash until activated, and spoke in burst patterns that to old monitoring systems looked like cosmic noise. The assembly had spent centuries building roads. Humans started building whispers. At the same time, in laboratories under the ice of Europa and beneath the basalt caps of Mars, the project that would truly decide everything was moving from theory into hard metal. It began with equations that had been rejected 9 years earlier by an assembly propulsion board because they enabled unsupervised high-range transit profiles. That was the official reason. The real reason was simpler. A species that can move where it wants is much harder to manage. Dr. Sanaa Cade, a drive physicist with a habit of speaking softly enough that people leaned in and therefore listened harder, reopened the entire file set and ignored every note stamped by external reviewers. She and her team were not trying to make the approved drive more efficient. They were trying to break the logic behind it. Assembly drives treated folded space like a lane you entered and followed. Sanaa suspected folded space behaved less like a lane and more like tension in fabric. If the field could be gripped correctly, a ship would not slide through a route. It would pull itself across the stress lines directly. Most people thought the math was unstable. The first test vessel almost proved them right. It vanished for 11 agonizing minutes, reappeared 2 million kilometers off target, and arrived with half its instrumentation fused. Sana watched the telemetry, stared at the scorch patterns, and smiled in the frightening way exhausted geniuses do when disaster confirms possibility. "It worked badly," she said. "That means it worked." Quick pause. If you love stories where humans answer exclusion by building something bigger, tap like and share this with another sci-fi fan, because the real turn starts now. By month 19, the new drive was real, not polished, not elegant, real. The first production model, called the Hush drive because it entered fold space with almost no detectable bloom, could manage 39 light-years per day under controlled loads. That number alone rewrote human strategy. At assembly speeds, 600 light-years of exclusion was a hard deterrent. At Hush speed, it was less than 3 weeks of cautious travel and much less for courier hulls. More important than speed was freedom. Hush transits did not need assembly map channels. They did not need recognized beacons. They did not announce themselves to every licensed monitor in the region. For the first time since joining the wider galaxy, humanity could move without asking old systems how. Elara received the first successful long-range test report while standing on a bare platform inside Lantern 3, wearing an environment coat dusted white from fabrication snow. She read the numbers twice, then looked up at the black horizon of the unfinished dome and laughed once, sharply, as if her body had no better place to put the relief. Beside her, calm, Mander Ilian Ro asked if the result was good. Elara answered, "It means they mistook delay for control." But speed alone does not make history. Plenty of empires move quickly toward the same old mistake. Elara knew that if humanity used its new freedom only to arm itself, the assembly would eventually be proven right in the story it was already telling. The real answer had to be political, moral, and personal at once. Humanity needed friends faster than it needed fleets, not paper allies, not coerced clients, not desperate dependents. Friends. So while shipyards worked and labs burned night into day, another branch of the Long Night Initiative expanded quietly under an entirely different logic. It was called the Return List. 31 species had voted against the expulsion. Many had done so at real cost. Some lost committee standing. Some saw inspection teams descend on their ports. Some were cut out of trade negotiations or forced to sit through stability consultations, clearly meant as warnings. A few had voted yes publicly after internal pressure but sent private signals of regret through back channels. Elara did not confuse courage with purity. She knew how power corners people. She cared about trajectories. Who had reached toward humanity when it was inconvenient? Who had tried to? Who might, if approached with respect instead of demand? The first contact ship under the return list carried no Marines and almost no weapons beyond basic point defense. It carried water purification membranes tuned for the copper-heavy rivers of the Ithari worlds, along with a complete open-source fabrication library for producing the membranes locally. The Ithari had been one of the 31 no votes, a reef-dwelling species spread across 9 storm oceans whose disaster relief request 3 years earlier had been delayed by assembly review because it did not rank as a high trade priority. Humans had helped anyway through personal channels, and the Ithari remembered. When the human envoy arrived unannounced in a vessel the Ithari sensors could not classify, panic broke out for 11 minutes, then gave way to stunned silence when the ship identified itself in an old shared emergency code. The meeting took place in a pressure hall over violet water. Elara attended by projection. The Ithari foreign speaker asked the only question that mattered. "What do you want from us?" Elara answered. "Nothing today. Today, we wanted you to know we are still here, and that we remember who stood up when the room got ugly." The Ithari accepted the gift after 2 days of internal debate. They sent back a package of storm navigation data no assembly archive possessed. The exchange was materially useful. Emotionally, it was something larger. It proved the principle. Then came the Now breach, a small machine-augmented civilization living across 5 old mining moons at the edge of assembly notice. Then the serene archive worlds, whose monks had once sheltered human translators during a plague lockdown. Then the Celt caravans, wandering convoy nations who officially abstained on the expulsion but quietly distributed human emergency comm keys to anyone who asked. The pattern remained the same. Humans arrived privately. Humans brought something real. A medical advance, a power grid trick, a relay patch, a seed vault template, an asteroid cracking protocol, a field treatment for pressure lung, no contracts, no hidden clauses, no demand for exclusive access, no speech about shared destiny, just usefulness offered with memory attached. That alone was disruptive. The assembly had trained the galaxy to expect price tags. Humanity kept showing up with gifts and a dangerous sentence beneath them: "You owe us nothing." It is amazing how quickly that kind of honesty spreads in a tired civilization. Inside the assembly, meanwhile, the story being told about humanity remained flattering to the assembly and blind to everything that mattered. Official briefs described the exclusion as stable. Surveillance around Saul confirmed reduced human traffic through approved corridors. Licensed trade had collapsed as expected. Public messaging insisted that the measure had prevented broader unrest and preserved interspecies order. Some officials even used humanity as a case study in responsible containment. But the cracks began at the edges, where all real change begins. An Ethari procurement office stopped attending certain resource harmonization councils. A Celt convoy declined a joint security review. Two Serene Archive delegates quietly refused to support a censure against a minor species accused of unauthorized knowledge exchange. None of these were dramatic acts. That was why they mattered. Fear keeps systems rigid. Hope makes them slippery. The old machine started noticing slippage before it understood its source. At the center of that old machine sat Chancellor Voran Tao, Senior Coordinator of Intermember Stability, a title so bloodless it almost concealed the force behind it. Voran had helped draft the protective exile measure. He was not theatrical, not cruel in the childish sense, and not given to hatred for its own sake. That made him more dangerous. He believed that civilizations survived by accepting structure, that freedom without moderation led to cascading wars, and that young species in particular needed limits until their emotional volatility burned down into something governable. He had watched humanity with increasing disapproval for years, too affectionate, too improvisational, too willing to bend procedure for lived relationships, too popular with minor worlds. When the first new discrepancies appeared in his reports, he did not dismiss them. He commissioned deeper audits. The audits came back clean. No registered human transmissions, no approved ship contacts, no legal trade traces, nothing. For most administrators, that would have been comfort. For Voran, it was the beginning of alarm. If the outcomes were changing while the records remained empty, then human influence had not ended. It had gone dark. Elara knew the old order would notice eventually. That was never the question. The question was whether humanity could build faster than the assembly could understand. That is why lantern sites multiplied. 1 became 4, 4 became 9. Some were full colonies, some were industrial waste stations, some were relay nests hidden inside dead systems with almost no habitable value at all. A few existed for one reason only: to manufacture things very far from prying eyes. The largest of them all, planned at the intersection of 3 deep vectors beyond every charted border, was not a world but a station. Its first girders were laid in the shadow of a rogue dwarf star with almost no visible signature. From above, the structure looked like a broken ring wrapped around a cathedral of scaffolds. Elara named it Haven Spine. The builders hated the name. They said it sounded like a hospital. Then the first habitation drums lit, and the black around them filled with controlled motion, and people began calling it Haven anyway because sometimes names have to grow into themselves. The purpose of Haven was never merely industrial. It was architectural in the civilizational sense. Humanity needed a place big enough not just to manufacture, but to host, to receive. to gather species that had never been allowed to meet one another except through assembly-managed formality. The assembly had central halls on core worlds polished by centuries of precedent. Haven would be raw steel, adaptable gravity, modular atmosphere fields, unfinished rail lines, and broad rooms made for people who were still deciding what they wanted to become together. Elara liked the honesty of that. Marble tells a lie too early. Bare beams admit that history is under construction. If you're still with me, you are exactly the kind of viewer this channel is for. Subscribe, drop a like, and send this video to one friend who loves watching power shift in silence before it explodes in public. The trigger for the next phase came from a place nobody in the assembly respected enough: a freight insurance office. One clerk on a middling world noticed that several trade disruptions blamed on random route instability were oddly concentrated around species that had opposed humanity's expulsion. Another clerk noticed that those same species had recently reduced demand for a class of assembly relay maintenance contracts. Separately, these were trivial details. Together, they suggested independence. The report moved upward. Voron received it on a tired morning and understood at once what the rest of the system did not want to see. Containment had failed because containment assumed humanity needed visibility to matter. He authorized a long-range survey task force to probe beyond charted margins in the sectors most statistically likely to host unlicensed activity. Not warships, surveyors. 32 vessels with deep sensors, legal authority, and enough escort capability to survive if they found nothing more dangerous than smugglers or hidden extraction rigs. To the assembly, it was a quiet corrective. To Elara, once the Athari passed the leak through 3 trusted hands, it was a countdown. She was on Haven when the warning arrived. The station was only 63% complete by structural measure, but already alive in a way no simulation had captured. Fabricators sang through the walls. Cargo webs glowed like nerve tissue across open trusses. Whole neighborhoods existed under plastic sheeting and temporary weather fields. There were children there now, because once humans build a place that can hold heat and water, family follows. Elara stood in the central gathering hall, a chamber so vast that unfinished balconies vanished into shadow above, and listened as Commander Rowe finished the intelligence summary. The Assembly Survey Force would reach the Outer Lantern chain in just under 5 weeks if it might. Maintained standard advance speed, less if it got lucky, more if storms forced detours, not enough more to matter. Haven was supposed to host a preliminary conference in 4 months. Elara looked up at the skeleton of the hall, at the empty air where delegates would one day sit, and changed the calendar of the future with a single sentence. "Move it forward," she said. "We stop preparing to be ready. We become ready under pressure." That conference, once accelerated, turned into the most ambitious invitation humanity had ever issued. It went not only to the 31 dissenting species and the gray zone contacts surrounding them, but to any polity that had felt the Assembly's hierarchy more heavily than its protection. Some were tiny. Some were mid-sized and cautious. Some were ashamed that they had voted the wrong way during humanity's expulsion and had been waiting for a chance to tell the truth with actions rather than apologies. The invitation was clear, simple, and almost offensively open. Come to Haven, see what we are building. Bring no oath, sign nothing unless you believe it. Leave if you choose, observe if you prefer, speak freely. No part of the meeting will be conditional on prior allegiance. That last line mattered most. The Assembly had taught the galaxy that membership always begins with surrendering room to breathe. Humanity was offering the opposite, room first. As preparations accelerated, the deepest arguments inside human leadership returned. What exactly was being built? Some wanted a defensive league. Some wanted a parallel trade zone. Some wanted a sovereign bloc with hard military teeth from day one. Elara fought all 3 labels. If we build ourselves in reaction to them, she told the drafting council, then they still define us. She insisted the foundation must begin with principles that no frightened species would need to regret later. Sovereignty could not be conditional. Exit could not be punishable. Shared infrastructure could not become leverage. Technology exchanges could not be hidden behind dependency traps. Mutual defense had to exist, but it had to be entered, not inherited. There would be no supreme capital world, no ruling species, no permanent chair. Humans would host first because humans had started this under pressure, but humans would not own what came after. More than once, frustrated admirals accused her of wasting a historic chance to put humanity above the table instead of under it. Elara's answer never changed. If all we wanted was to sit in the tallest chair, then the assembly was right to fear us. The founding charter took shape in the ugliest rooms imaginable: temporary offices, half-sealed domes, transit lounges between jumps, emergency comm windows at absurd hours. Human lawyers argued with Celt navigators about definitions of passage. Ithari civic philosophers rewrote human language around consent. The Serene Archive representatives challenged every clause that could someday be twisted into domination. A frontier mining union from Lantern 6 demanded labor protections before military protocols. Everyone was inconvenient. That was how Elara knew it was real. Easy coalitions are usually masks for one strong party getting its way. This was friction without collapse, which meant the center was holding for the right reasons. Meanwhile, the Assembly Survey Force entered the dark. Its lead ships found evidence of human passage sooner than expected. Not clear evidence, clever evidence. A heat smear in an otherwise dead comet field. An energy scatter that looked natural until compared against 20 years of background records. Depleted mining residue too pure for accident. Then, on the 23rd day of survey, the Force found Lantern 2. It was not hidden anymore because by then Elara had decided it should not be. The outpost sat in plain view: orbital yards, habitation bands, defense lattices, cargo platforms, spin-grown agriculture drums, and 41 docked hulls of human design operating well beyond assembly authority. The survey commander transmitted a legal inquiry and received an automated reply in clear assembly standard. The message welcomed the task force to sovereign frontier infrastructure operating under the provisional protection of a newly formed interstellar compact. It provided coordinates for a diplomatic session already scheduled at Haven. It included a list of attending species. The survey commander read the list once, then again, then ordered every recorder on his bridge to triple verification because there were names on it that should have been impossible. If this kind of slow burn payoff is your thing, hit like right now and share the video, because the old order is about to look into the dark and realize the dark has been looking back. The founding at Haven began 6 days before the survey commander's report reached the Assembly Corps. That timing was not accidental. It was Elara's private answer to the applause she had heard in T. The Expulsion Hall. If the galaxy wanted spectacle, it could have one. Just not the kind it expected. Delegates arrived through hidden vectors, escorted by human couriers using hush transit windows too irregular for outside prediction. Some came alone. Some came with whole advisory teams. Some came terrified. The hall at Haven was still unfinished. No ceremonial skins covered the beams. Parts of the upper ring were open to scaffold light. The floor smelled faintly of machine oil beneath the fresh atmosphere mix. Elara insisted nothing be hidden. Let them see the welds, she said. Let them see the work. Let them understand this was made by hands, not inherited through age. 28 species attended in person. Another 9 observed by secured relay. Of those 28, 19 had openly opposed the expulsion. 4 had once supported it and now sought a path away from their own compromise. 3 were unaligned frontier polities too distant for the assembly to have fully absorbed. 2 came as trade witnesses and became something else before the week was over. The opening session lasted 13 hours. It should have been chaos. Instead, it became one of the most quietly electric moments in galactic history. For many in that room, it was the first time they had spoken without assuming every word would be interpreted through assembly hierarchy. There was no central throne, no species elevation ring, no precedence lights. Elara stood on a plain platform under unfinished steel and did not deliver a grand speech. She asked one question. How many of you have signed agreements you did not truly feel free to refuse? No one answered at first. Then one delegate raised a hand, then another, then another. By the end, nearly everyone in the room had. That question changed the room because it named the wound beneath 1,000 technical disputes. The assembly was not hated simply because it was powerful. It was exhausting because it had turned dependence into culture. Smaller worlds learned to smile while swallowing conditions. Mid-tier worlds learned to defend unfairness because they feared falling one rung lower. Young civilizations mistook permission for partnership. Humanity's expulsion had been horrifying, yes, but it had also been clarifying in a way no policy paper ever could be. The assembly had shown its hand too openly. It had proved that when friendship started bypassing its channels, it would punish not harm but unsupervised closeness. Many species had felt that truth before. Humanity merely made it visible. Over 4 days, the founding charter was read, broken apart, amended, rebuilt, and finally spoken into record. Its first principle was simple enough for a child and radical enough to threaten systems 9 centuries old. No world, people, fleet, or habitat may be coerced into belonging. Its second principle followed naturally. No member may be expelled by vote. Departure must remain possible without collective punishment. The third established shared infrastructure as a commons, not ownership. If one member helped build a relay, gate, archive, mednet, or transit spine on another member's territory, that contribution could not become a chain. The fourth defined mutual defense narrowly and clearly, because Elara had no interest in birthing an excuse for endless intervention. Protection could be requested, offered, and coordinated, but not presumed. The fifth and perhaps most subversive principle required technical transparency in any system likely to produce dependency. No hidden throttles, no black box choke points, no standard that only one powerful member truly understood. If a road connected free worlds, then free worlds had to know how the road worked. The name took longer. Humans suggested the Open Reach Compact. The Ithari preferred a phrase that translated roughly to shared tide. The Celt offered a caravan term meaning fire between camps. The serene delegates argued that every beautiful name risked being used as a brand before it earned moral weight. Late on the third night, after too much coffee and not enough sleep, a maintenance child carrying tool packs through the upper gantries looked down at the delegates arguing and asked her father what they were doing. He answered, trying to decide what to call a place where people can come without being owned. The line spread. By morning, the name was done. It became the Commonwealth of Arrival. No one loved it instantly. That was another reason Elara approved it. It sounded less like conquest than a promise. You may arrive, you may remain yourself. The signing broke people in ways they did not expect. Not because it was flashy, because it was quiet. One by one, delegates stepped forward and placed hand, claw, tendril, seal, or encoded imprint into the charter plate. Some cried openly. Some stood as still as stone because that was how their species processed magnitude. A Celt convoy elder whose people had spent 200 years paying corridor fees to powers that never protected them pressed his forehead to the steel and whispered, "At last, a road that does not demand kneeling." When the final signature landed, 26 full members and 7 probationary observers had joined. Humanity did not become their ruler. Humanity became the point where the map had torn and been sewn into something larger. The Assembly Survey Force reached Haven's outer sensor shadow 3 days later. By then the Commonwealth already existed. The commander received a direct hail from Elara herself. Her face appeared on his bridge in clean light, calm and almost strangely kind. "Commander," she said, "you are observing a sovereign intermember station operating in unclaimed space by the mutual consent of its participants. Your presence is noted and permitted. If your government would like a briefing, one is prepared. If your government would like to threaten us, please be efficient. We have work to do." The commander, a veteran who had expected smugglers and found a civilizational event, asked the only sane question available to him. "How many of you are there?" Elara answered. "Enough that your report will be read more than once." At the Assembly Corps, Vorontal read that report in a sealed chamber with 8 senior officials and understood, in full, that the expulsion had become the greatest strategic failure of his career. The measure had not isolated humanity. It had liberated human development from oversight, pushed human industry into untaxed regions, and handed humans the moral language of exclusion before a watching galaxy. Worse, humanity had not simply built hidden fortresses. It had built a political alternative. That was the part Voron hated most. Weapons can be matched. Infrastructure can be sabotaged. But an idea that names everyone's private humiliation, that spreads by recognition. When lesser worlds learned that there now existed a network where membership did not begin with surrender, the assembly would bleed slowly and then quickly. Voron's first instinct was suppression, not open war. Open war risked making martyrs of the new compact. Instead, he proposed pressure, legal notices, membership reviews for defecting species, corridor audits, financial penalties, transit complications, quiet demonstrations of consequence. But even inside the assembly, resistance emerged. Some core delegates warned that overreaction would drive more worlds toward the Commonwealth. Others asked the question no one had wanted to ask 2 years earlier. If humanity had built all this in secret so quickly, what else had the Assembly's developmental restrictions been preventing across the entire galaxy? The room divided not over whether humanity was a problem, but over whether the problem was human ambition or Assembly arrogance. That split alone was historic. If you love sci-fi where the real battle is over who gets to define freedom, subscribe now and stay with me. Because the next move is the moment humanity proves this was never just about survival. While the assembly argued, Elara made her own move. Atlas Dawn still had not been returned. 1,112 civilians remained in protective administrative custody at a transit holding station near the edge of former human access space. The Commonwealth's founding session had included their situation in every closed-door briefing because Elara understood symbolism. The assembly thought hostages slowed human escalation. In truth, the hostages had become the test by which every new member judged whether the Commonwealth was merely admirable or actually serious. So Elara transmitted a formal request through every legal channel still recognized by assembly procedure. The request was concise. The civilians aboard Atlas Dawn were non-combatants unlawfully detained following a political expulsion. Their immediate release was required. The request also included, attached in perfect technical summary, 3 facts the Assembly had not yet publicly admitted. First, the Commonwealth now operated 52 settled or semi-settled sites across the Hollow. Second, the Hush Drive had completed 217 successful long-range transits at a speed more than 8 times the old approved human norm. Third, 7 current Assembly members had joined the Commonwealth as full participants, with more under review. Elara ended the message with a line that stunned every clerk who processed it. This is not an appeal for mercy. It is an opportunity for good judgment. The Assembly responded with delay, committees, review language, jurisdictional queries, a statement that the matter was complicated by cross-status custody considerations. Elara expected all of it. She gave them 12 days and then sent a second message, this time public to every Commonwealth member and every observer world willing to receive it. Children are not procedural complexity, it read. Families are not jurisdictional nuance. Return our people. That G spread farther than any human signal since the expulsion. On worlds that had never met a human, people still understood the shape of the sentence. Not because it was poetic, because bureaucracy everywhere uses complexity to cover moral cowardice. Suddenly, Atlas Dawn was not a human issue. It was a mirror. Assembly counter-narratives appeared within hours. Humans were being emotionally manipulative. The detainees were safe. Transition care took time. Security clearances were pending. Independent assessment was needed. But those lines were weaker now because the assembly was no longer speaking into a vacuum. The Commonwealth translated every statement, annotated every evasion, and let other species judge. The Ethari broadcast a simple question through their internal civic networks. If safety is the reason, why has safety required 14 months? The Celt convoy unions, masters of weaponized plain speech, asked something blunter. If they are guests, why can't they leave? Once those questions circulated beyond human channels, delay became politically expensive. Voron pushed for firmness. Release under pressure, he warned, would signal that the assembly could be forced. But he had misread the stage. The assembly had already signaled weakness the moment it failed to understand what humanity was doing in the dark. Now every additional day of custody did not make the institution look resolute. It made it look petty, frightened, and morally small. Even worlds that distrusted human momentum could see that. The internal struggle lasted 9 days. On the 10th, a quiet authorization order left core channels. Atlas Dawn civilians would be transferred at a neutral boundary station under humanitarian framing. No admission of error, no apology, no public concession. The assembly would act as though it had intended reasonable release all along. It was a face-saving move, which is to say it was a human victory. Elara traveled personally to receive them. The transfer station was ugly, metallic, temporary, and perfect. Great moments should happen in honest places. Commonwealth representatives from 12 species attended, not for theater but witness. When the transport seal opened, the first people who emerged did not cheer. They hesitated. 14 months in controlled custody had taught them caution. Then a little boy, born 3 weeks before Atlas Dawn's departure and now old enough to understand rooms, saw the human crest on Elara's shoulder and asked his mother, very loudly, "Are we back with our own?" That sound cracked the space. Adults who had held themselves together through inspection, delay, and careful hope started crying. So did some of the guards, though they turned away when it happened. Elara greeted every family she could without pretending presence erased damage. She met an agronomist who had lost her partner to stress-related heart failure in custody. She met twins who had forgotten the taste of fresh fruit. She met an engine tech who kept apologizing for surviving when others had not. She met a child who did not trust closed doors and another who had spent 14 months drawing suns because she was afraid space would forget light. Later, in the privacy of the receiving bay, Commander Rowe asked Elara whether the assembly understood what releasing the detainees had cost it. Elara looked through the viewport at Commonwealth banners hanging beside human ones, beside Ethari-tied glass, beside Celt caravan cloth, beside symbols that would never again fit neatly under one old institution's control. "Not yet," she said, "but the galaxy does." The return of Atlas Dawn did more than restore lives. It did what major events always do. It changed what people believed was possible. Before that moment, many worlds saw the Commonwealth as brave, interesting, perhaps useful, but uncertain. After that moment, it became proven. Here was a network barely 2 years old that had forced the most entrenched authority in known space to yield living people. Applications surged. Quiet inquiries became formal requests. Worlds that had tolerated assembly condescension for generations began running risk models they had never dared calculate. How dependent were they really? What if relay knowledge were shared? What if corridor access could be diversified? What if dispute arbitration did not automatically favor legacy powers? Every one of those questions was destabilizing because each contained a new assumption. Alternatives exist. Elara refused to let momentum turn into vanity. She knew revolutions fail when they start believing headlines about themselves. So she widened the Commonwealth slowly and with irritating discipline. Candidate worlds underwent open review. Existing members could object publicly. Shared infrastructure obligations were disclosed line by line. Every new relay route came with published maintenance knowledge. Every defense accord included sunset clauses and exit options. Human commanders hated the ANI. Efficiency. Some Commonwealth delegates hated it too, but the slowness itself became persuasive. The old galaxy was full of systems that offered safety first and took sovereignty second. The Commonwealth looked maddening because it kept proving that freedom was not a marketing phrase. It was operational design. By the beginning of the third year after expulsion, the numbers no longer fit inside comfortable old categories. The Commonwealth had 43 full-member civilizations, 12 associate polities, and more than 80 distributed habitats, shipyards, relay webs, archive vaults, and industrial way stations across the Hollow and its adjoining regions. Human population had begun spreading not as isolated colonies, but as linked communities embedded in mixed civic corridors. Ithari marine biologists advised terraformers on wet worlds. Kelt navigation masters trained human pilots in drift corridors no assembly ship had ever attempted. Serene archive mediators helped settle the first intermember labor dispute without threat or coercion. Refugee settlements from 3 minor conflicts requested observer status because, as one elder put it, "We have lived long enough under structures built to manage us. We would like to try one built to receive us." The phrase stuck, "to receive us." It became one of those simple human-readable truths that no amount of legal rhetoric can erase. Small break, big favor. If this story is hitting the way I hoped, like the video, share it with another HFY fan and stay to the end, because the last phase is where the galaxy finally understands what it created. The assembly still had fleets. It still controlled ancient corridors, rich cores, major markets, and the prestige of age. On paper, it remained the larger power, but paper is often the last place reality updates. What the assembly lacked now was narrative control. Its founding myth had always been simple. Without us, the galaxy fragments into predation and chaos. Humanity's existence beyond the wall had become a living counterexample, not a utopia. The Commonwealth had disputes, shortages, sabotage attempts, ugly votes, cultural clashes, corruption cases, black market scandals, failed settlements, and one catastrophic fusion accident that cost 900 lives at a deep forge near Haven. Elara never hid those failures. She understood something old powers forget. Transparency about pain is more credible than polished perfection. The Commonwealth's message was not that freedom prevents mistakes. It was that mistakes should not become excuses for ownership. Voron Tal made one final attempt to reframe the field. He proposed a grand reconciliation summit, publicly described as an opportunity to normalize relations with humanity, and privately intended to pull Commonwealth members back into the Assembly's legal gravity one concession at a time. The invitation went to Earth, to Haven, and to every Assembly member rumored to be considering Commonwealth alignment. Many human officials wanted to refuse on principle. Elara accepted immediately. Ro thought she was joking. She was not. "We do not fear rooms anymore," she told him. That was the old lesson. She also knew something deeper. The summit would force the Assembly to speak plainly in front of worlds it no longer fully controlled. Any demand it made would reveal its assumptions. Any concession it offered would reveal weakness. Sometimes the fastest way to expose a system is to let it explain itself. The summit took place on Oral Prime, a glittering core world built to intimidate visitors with continuity. Rivers diverted through sculpture parks. Artificial moons displayed historical treaties in rotating light. Delegates entered through halls lined with portraits of founders whose greatest political talent had been arriving first and staying longest. But the room felt different this time. Commonwealth delegates did not come as petitioners. They came as an alternative center of gravity. Human crews translated their own feeds. Kelt and Ithari security stood openly beside human escorts. Serene observers requested public record protocols the Assembly could not refuse without embarrassment. When Voron opened with language about restoring mutual confidence under stable common frameworks, he sounded reasonable. Then Elara asked one question in front of everyone. Will membership in any future framework require worlds to surrender independent transit capability or relay knowledge? Voron tried to answer with nuance. That was a mistake. Nuance in certain moments is just fear taking the scenic route. By the time he finished, Everyone in the chamber understood that yes, under prettier wording, dependence was still the intended price. The summit did not explode. It leaked. That was worse for the assembly. Transcript segments spread through both official and unofficial networks. Worlds far from the core listened as Elara dismantled assumptions that had governed their lives for centuries. C. Security without exit is ownership. Standards that only one party can administer are leashes. If your peace requires permanent immaturity in younger civilizations, it is not peace, it is management. Voron fought back with the language of risk, escalation, and historical memory. Some of what he said was not wrong. He had seen wars. He knew what chaos looked like. But Elara's advantage was that she did not promise innocence. She promised adulthood. "We are not children asking to stay out late," she said in the line every network replayed for weeks. "We are civilizations asking to possess our own motion." After the summit, defections did not come in a flood. They came in something more dangerous, a credible stream, corridor by corridor, sector by sector. Some assembly members kept dual affiliation. Some fully withdrew after years of staged transition. Some never joined the Commonwealth but used its existence to renegotiate old terms with the assembly. Elara counted even that as victory. The purpose had never been to replace one monopoly with another. The purpose was to make monopoly impossible. By year 5, more worlds used Commonwealth transit standards in part or in full than the Assembly had expected in 2 generations. By year 6, Haven's linked industrial web could outproduce the total shipyard mass of 3 midcore Assembly regions. By year 7, human-designed hush derivatives had become so widespread across partner worlds that the old corridors no longer defined strategic movement. The map still showed core and fringe, center and edge, sanctioned and unsanctioned. Reality no longer obeyed the lines. People across the galaxy began using a word the Commonwealth never chose for itself: empire. Analysts on core networks used it as a warning. Frontier storytellers used it with awe. Critics used it with suspicion. Admirers used it with delight. The empire in the hollow, the empire of roads without gates, the quiet empire. Elara hated the word at first. She heard in it the old gravity of ownership, tribute, hierarchy, and extracted obedience. But language is a living thing. It goes where people's fear and wonder push it. Over time, even she understood what they meant. They did not mean emperor. They did not mean throne. They meant scale. They meant reach. They meant that from one exclusion order, humanity had helped assemble the largest connected political structure in known history, not by seizing the most territory, but by making itself the hinge on which more and more free decisions turned. It was the biggest empire the galaxy had ever seen, and it was built mostly out of invitations. That irony mattered. History had seen conquerors before. Plenty of species expanded through force, tribute, dynastic claim, superior tech, or strategic terror. Their maps grew fast and shrank faster. The Commonwealth spread differently. Every new route increased the value of old routes without locking them. Every new member made exits safer because alternatives multiplied. Every shared archive reduced the power of gatekeepers. Every ship that crossed the dark without asking core permission taught another generation that official roads are not the same as possible roads. Humanity's genius, if the word must be used, was not domination. It was emotional engineering at civilizational scale. We understood that the deepest hunger in the galaxy was not protection. It was dignity with neighbors. The Assembly had misread countless worlds because it assumed safety mattered more than self-respect. Safety matters. Hunger matters. Energy grids matter. But after a certain point, people will cross terrible distances for the chance to be treated like adults. Elara aged during those years in ways cameras could not hide. The woman who had sat silent in the expulsion hall became someone children recognized from textbooks and freight murals. Her hair silvered early. Her public speaking never grew grand. She remained irritatingly precise. She still reviewed cargo flow summaries at impossible hours. She still visited work sites without warning and asked welders what the official reports were missing. She still read casualty names herself after accidents. When asked in one late interview whether she had known humanity would build something so vast, she shook her head. "No," she said. "I knew only that being locked out would teach us what doors really are." Then she added the line historians argue about even now. The wall was never around us. It was around their imagination. If you've made it this far, write "no permission needed" in the comments. Subscribe for more stories like this, and keep listening, because the ending is the part that stays with you. The moment many later historians choose as the true turning point did not happen at Haven, or the summit, or the release of Atlas Dawn. It happened in a schoolroom on a world that had once paid corridor tax for every kilogram of medicine it imported. A child there asked her teacher why. The assembly map still marked her home as peripheral when so many ships passed through now. The teacher answered, because maps take time to admit they were drawn by proud people. That is the kind of sentence that only becomes possible after structures shift. Once enough ordinary beings live in a new reality, old prestige can linger, but it no longer commands belief. The assembly continued. It did not vanish overnight. Some of its institutions adapted and survived. Some even became better once they were forced to compete with voluntary models. Vorontal retired into studied silence after a final failed reform package. A few core worlds doubled down and grew brittle. Others softened. The galaxy did not become paradise. It became plural. That was enough. And what of Earth, the world once fenced off like a problem? Earth changed too. The exclusion had initially turned inward our fears, our anger, our oldest habit of dividing ourselves under stress. But the labor of building the hollow required a scale of coordination that re-educated us, not morally perfected us, re-educated us. Nations remained, cultures deepened, arguments never stopped. Yet for the first time in history, humanity's daily imagination stretched naturally beyond a single homeworld without dissolving into fantasy. Schoolchildren on Earth learned Ethari-tied mathematics and Celt drift songs. Martian apprentices trained beside serene archive keepers. Lunar food markets sold caravan spice rolls named after convoy routes farther than old human fiction had dared set. The phrase, human space, slowly became too small. There was Earth. There were the lanterns. There was Haven. There were the commons, the corridors, the settlements, the mixed ports, the emergency beacons maintained by species that had once known one another only through licensed distance. Home stopped meaning origin alone. It started meaning the places that would receive you. Sometimes that frightened people. Vastness should frighten us a little. The Commonwealth's very success created new risks. Regional blocks formed inside it. Economic asymmetries emerged. Human industrial weight remained outsized for a long time, and not everyone trusted that forever. There were disputes over migration, over defense burdens, over cultural dilution, over whether deep space infrastructure ought to be centrally audited after a sabotage event at Lantern 9. Critics warned that every open system eventually invents its own gatekeepers. Elara agreed often enough to keep everyone uncomfortable. That danger is permanent, she said. Freedom is not a machine you build once. It is a maintenance problem. That line never became as famous as her others because it was less cinematic. It was also probably the most important thing she ever said. Years later, long after the first release of Atlas Dawn, Elara returned privately to the hall where humanity had been expelled. The assembly chamber still stood. The flags had changed. Some sigils were gone. Some new ones had joined. The symmetry remained, but it no longer felt invincible. She visited as part of a formal observer exchange, and for 20 minutes she sat alone in the same public gallery seat where she had once listened to applause. No cameras, no speech, just memory. A custodian from a minor world recognized her and almost backed away in embarrassment, but Elara waved him over. He asked, with the awkward bravery of ordinary people, whether it was strange coming back. She looked out over the chamber floor and answered, "Less strange than I expected." He asked what she was thinking. She took a long time before speaking. "That rooms reveal themselves," she said. "Some are built to contain, some are built to welcome. You can tell the difference by what happens when someone arrives without permission." That is the final truth of the story. Humanity was banished to the void, yes, cast away, cut off, branded as unstable, too personal, too independent, too difficult to manage. And for a brief moment, the galaxy thought that would be the end of us. The old powers believed isolation would shrink us because they assumed community only grows where systems approve it. They thought the dark between maps was dead space. They thought distance was emptiness. They thought young civilizations, once denied the comfort of established roads, would curl up around their losses and ask to be readmitted. They were wrong about all of it. Distance was cover. Darkness was room. Loss was instruction. And humans, more than anything else, were a species that turned insult into infrastructure. We did not answer exile by pounding on the gate forever. We answered it by learning how many stars existed beyond the gatekeeper's map. We answered it by remembering who had been kind when kindness cost something. We answered it by building roads nobody owned, homes nobody had to kneel to enter, and a union vast enough that the galaxy ran out of old words and started calling it an empire simply Beck. As it did not know what else to call something so large built without chains. That is why the ending matters. Not because humanity won a vote. Not because the assembly blinked. Not even because the detainees came home, though that alone would have been enough to mark the age. It matters because one civilization, pushed out into silence, chose not to become a sharper prison with a different flag. It chose to become an arrival point. And once enough worlds know there is somewhere they can arrive without being owned, history does not go back. The stars do not forget that kind of lesson. Neither do people. So if you ever wonder what the most dangerous thing in the galaxy might be, it is not the fleet with the biggest guns, or the world with the oldest laws, or the empire with the widest core. It is a people who have learned how to build in the dark after being told the dark was all they deserved. Because once they know that, once they have crossed that distance and found one another there, you can banish them from your system, your chamber, your markets, your records, even your map. And all you really do is give them more sky.